Hey everybody, welcome to our third webinar. Today we're talking about the integumentary system. As you can see by the slide, this system is composed of the skin and its appendages. When I say skin, I'm talking about the stratified squamous epithelium that covers our bodies. And even though it is continuous with the lining of our mouth, the epithelia in our mouth and esophagus, this stratified epithelia is keratinized, so we'll view it as being a separate organ. So it's just the skin, the stratified squamous epithelia that covers our body, our arms, our face, our legs, our skin. Okay. The appendages of the skin are all of the things found within the skin, or sorry, what's a better way of saying it? All the structures found in the skin, like our hair follicles and the hairs that grow from them, our glands, for example, our sweat glands, of which we have a couple types, our oil glands, as well as our fingernails. So those are the appendages of our skin. And together with the skin, these appendages make up the integumentary system. Just some fun facts about the integumentary system, or the skin specifically, and this has nothing to do with this slide. The skin is between 1.2 and 2.2 square meters, depending on the size of a person, and about 9 to 11 pounds. So this makes it the largest organ in the body. And yes, the skin is an organ. Our skin is often called the integument. That's something we've sort of covered already. Integument means covering, so it makes sense that the skin is called the integument. And depending on where in the body you are, this covering, our skin, is about 1.5 to 4 millimeters thick. Okay, so the first and main component of the integumentary system is the skin. The skin is made up of two main regions, two layers. The first being the epidermis. This is the outer layer, the layer that we can see with our eyes. And then just deep to that is the dermis. Now, both of these layers have many sublayers that we'll talk about later. But for now, just know that the two main components of the skin are the epidermis and the dermis. The hypodermis technically isn't a part of the skin, but it helps the skin accomplish its functions, so it's listed here. The hypodermis is the subcutaneous tissue, which means the tissue under the skin. It's mostly fat. It is sometimes called the superficial fascia because it is just superficial to the fascia that's wrapped around our muscles, the very tough fascia that binds all our muscles together. So anyways, the hypodermis lies in between the dermis and the fascia that covers our muscles, and it's mostly fat. Because it's fat and it's sort of loosely attached, it's loose connective tissue, it allows our skin to move. So if you put your hand on your forearm, you can slide your skin around. This is thought to help protect us from blows and protect our skin from getting rips in it because it gives the skin some give. It's also a nutrient storage center, so it makes sense, right? It's mostly fat. This is a part of our body that actually will grow if we are taking in more calories than we're burning. So the Maria book that we use says it pretty in a funny way. It says something like, this region can grow quite substantially in some people. So anyways, so in addition to just allowing the skin to slide around, it is also going to provide a coat of insulation to keep heat in, as well as be a place where we can store fuel. All right, so moving on to the epidermis specifically, we find three types of cells. The main majority of the epidermis is composed of keratinocytes. These are cells whose job it is to make keratin. They're arranged in layers, and because of all the many layers and the special properties of these cells, skin is a tough, strong, waterproof coating that divides the inside of our body from the outside of our body. And the next few slides are going to kind of show how these cells accomplish that. In the very bottom layer, there are also some melanocytes whose little arms reach up into the layers above them. These cells produce melanin, which is a chemical that protects our cells from UV rays found in sunlight. Now, these cells produce melanin and then they transport it up their arms, which you can see in this picture, to be released. They transport using little motor proteins that go up the cytoskeleton, and these little vesicles are released throughout the layers to, mostly the bottom layers, to help protect our cells from the sun, from UV rays specifically. And the layer above that, which we'll find out later is called the stratum spinosum, we see dendritic cells. They used to be called Langerhans cells. You'll actually probably see them referred to as Langerhans cells quite a bit. There's kind of a push in the anatomy field to stop naming things after people. But you'll still see a lot of that. You'll still see a lot of structures in lab on the bones that are named after physicians and scientists and things. But there's kind of a push to name things after the shape, the structure, the location. So for example, these cells are called dendritic cells because they have dendrites, like neurons. Only these cells don't transmit impulses. They look for invaders, for bacteria, for viruses. If they find them, you can see these little dendrites sticking out. These interconnect. So it forms this web in your skin that doesn't allow any invaders to get through without one of these cells finding it. It then takes this, whatever it is, bacteria or whatever the invader is, to a white blood cell. And it presents a piece of this invader called an antigen to the white blood cell. Then the white blood cell can make antibodies or can activate other phagocytic cells like macrophages to mount a defense against whatever this invader is. So these dendritic cells are like an early warning system found in our skin. Okay, there's two types of skin, two types of epidermis. Thick skin, which is made up of 5 layers. This is found on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. And then thin skin, which is just missing one layer, called the stratum lucidum. So the difference between thick and thin skin is the presence or the absence of a layer of skin called the stratum lucidum. The stratum lucidum is a layer of the epidermis specifically. Okay, so let's talk about the bottom layer of the epidermis. We're going to be talking about thick skin. Just keep in mind that thin skin is the same thing, it just doesn't have the stratum lucidum. So we're going to be going from the bottom, or the deepest part of the epidermis, to the top, or the most superficial part of the dermis. So the very bottom layer, the deepest layer, which rests on the basement membrane. Remember, epithelial tissue rests on a basement membrane that has some connective tissue in it, as well as some a basal lamina, which is made up of the basal epithelial cells. So if we look at the very bottom layer of cells, we see the stratum basale, or basal, however you want to say it. I've heard it multiple ways. It's also often called the stratum germinatum because these cells divide rapidly. So germinatum, if you think about grass germinating, it's growing, it's multiplying. These cells are a single row of stem cells that are actively undergoing mitosis. When they divide, one cell stays behind as a stem cell to continue to divide, and one of the other cells, remember it divides into 2, so one stays behind and one goes on to become a keratinocyte. All right, so as this layer divides and multiplies, it pushes all the layers up, okay, until the very superficial layers start to flake off. And we know this is dandruff or flakes of skin coming off. These are the superficial older keratinocytes that are now dead, falling off to make way for the newer, younger keratinocytes from the deeper layers. There are also about 10 to 25% of this layer is melanocytes. Again, these are the cells that produce melanin. And there's also a very small amount of tactile cells. We'll see that most tactile cells, these are sensory receptors that can feel touch and temperature, are actually located in the dermis, but there are some that are located on the dermal epidermal border, but a very small amount of those. Okay, so moving up a layer, we're in the stratum spinosum. Now this is quite a bit thicker than the stratum basale. It it has a web-like intermediate filament network. Okay, so it has a network of intermediate filaments, and because of this, it's often called the prickly layer. Okay, so these intermediate filaments attach to desmosomes, and when we look at this tissue under a slide and all of the water is drained from the cells, this web of fibers and these desmosomes don't change shape. So as the cell membranes shrink, they look really prickly because there's all these fibers and desmosomes. Okay, so the cells here are often called prickle cells. But there really are no necessarily any different from the cells below. They're keratinocytes. They're just have this really strong web-like intermediate filament network to help support and give it structure. There are quite a bit of melanin granules here. This is where we'll probably see the highest concentration of melanin granules, as well as dendritic cells, which, if you remember, dendritic cells are those cells of Langerhans that look around for invaders. And here's a good picture of it here. You can see in the stratum spinosum, there's this blue cell with dendrites going out, forming a little web. And if you picture many of those, it forms a web that bacteria can't get through without at least getting caught and identified. These are kind of like the guards on a search tower looking out for bacteria coming in, and then they go get help. They send the antigen to some white blood cells to alert our immune system. Sorry, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want you guys to know. Remember, this is the second layer from the bottom. So the basal layer is the stratum basale, and then just above that, just superficial to that, is the stratum spinosum. Okay, has a strong intermediate filament network, and there are also dendritic cells here. That's important, and lots of melanin granules. Okay, so now we're looking at the stratum granulosum. This layer is very thin. If you look at this slide here, it just looks a few cell layers thick, about 4 to 6 cell layers thick. This is a really critical layer because this is where the keratinocytes begin a process called keratinization. Okay, this is actually a special form of apoptosis, which we haven't really talked about. Apoptosis is just pre-programmed cell death, all right? So the cells are dying on purpose. So the cells here are beginning to decompose, the nuclei and the organelles are beginning to disintegrate, and the cell is starting to flatten, okay? We're going to find 2 types of granules start to appear here. Remember, granules are just vesicles, little spheres containing something within the cell, okay? And sometimes they're called secretory granules because they're released and the contents release into the extracellular space. These 2 granules that we start to see here are called keratohyalin granules and lamellar granules. Keratohyalin granules are going to be important in forming keratin in the more superficial layers, in the stratum lucidum and stratum corneum. Lamellar granules are really important because they contain a water-resistant glycolipid, which prevents water loss. Okay, so this is a layer that really makes sure our skin is waterproof. That's very important. You don't want to absorb tons of water or lose tons of water through your skin. That'd be really hard on your body, on maintaining your blood pressure, on maintaining homeostasis. So these lamellar granules contain a glycolipid, and remember, lipid repels water because lipid is nonpolar and water is polar. This prevents water loss. Okay. At the same time, the organelles are beginning to disintegrate. The organelles and the nucleus are beginning to disintegrate. All of those proteins that are disintegrating and falling apart are going to move towards the cell membrane. Okay. Also, the keratohyalin and lamellar granules are going to start adhering to the outside of the membrane. This is going to make the cell membranes begin to thicken. Okay, so that's important. This layer is going to have thicker cell membranes than the layers below it. Okay, and those layers will continue to thicken as the cells move more superficial towards the top of the skin, towards the outer surface of the skin, and undergo more and more keratinization. Okay, so past this layer, Once we get past this layer, molecules from the connective tissue below, and this is something I really didn't mention earlier, and I'm going to now, but all the nutrients from the very lower layers, from the dermis, can't diffuse this far. So once we get to this level, cells are now dead, okay? Their organelles are disintegrated, they're not receiving any more nutrients. And this is what I forgot to tell you. I can't believe I skipped this part. This is what happens when I do this without notes. Like I usually have notes, but anyways, or better notes than what I have now. But the dermis, remember the deep layer of the dermis below is vascular, okay? It's made out of connective tissue and it's vascular. There's blood vessels. The epidermis, which is made out of epithelial tissue, has no blood vessels. It's avascular. It's innervated, but it's avascular. So it has nerves but no arteries. So it has to get all of its nutrients, and I'm speaking about the whole epidermis. It has to get its nutrients from the dermis, from the connective tissue in the dermis, from the blood vessels in the connective tissue in the dermis. So the nutrients diffuse superficially to the other layers of the skin. So that keeps the stratum basale, the most basal layer of the epidermis, and the stratum spinosum alive. Okay, they get their nutrients from the dermis. But if you look at the stratum granulosum, if you look how it's like a barrier in this picture, it's going to prevent any further diffusion of nutrients. And because of that, the cells above this layer will be dead. Okay, so this is what makes thick skin. All right, the presence of a stratum lucidum. It's actually not very thick, which is interesting. It's only 2 to 3 rows of clear, flat, dead keratinocytes, but it adds quite a bit of strength in high abrasion areas like the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Let me see what's important about this. Sorry, I'm just reading through the book here. Okay. So remember the keratohyalin granules we talked about in the stratum granulosum? These are now going to aggregate, so come together around this keratin filament network in this layer, making these really strong, large cables called tonofilaments. Okay, this is going to add tons of strength to the epidermis. It's like this little network of strong protein keratin cables running parallel to the skin in the stratum lucidum. Okay, so this layer will add a lot of strength. This layer is thin and translucent, so it's called the stratum lucidum. But its primary purpose is just to add some strength to the epidermis in areas of high abrasion, like the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, which are where we find thick skin. Okay, now we made it to the most superficial layer of the epidermis, which is called the stratum corneum. Cells here are anucleate, meaning that their nucleus is completely disintegrated. So the nucleus started disintegrating in the stratum granulosum. Now it is completely disintegrated. It's gone. This layer is 20 to 30 cells thick, which means that it's about 3/4 of the thickness of the epidermis. So this is the thickest layer of the epidermis, and it is going to have a very high keratin content. Okay, so remember, these cells are the most superficial, so they've been undergoing keratinization the longest, and remember, they're dead. So this is essentially just a layer designed to be strong and waterproof. Okay, which brings us to the next bullet point. The cell membranes here are very thick. Remember, I told you how the process began in the stratum granulosum, where the proteins collected along the membrane. That process has been going on for a very long time by this point. So these cell membranes are now very thick and very strong, and they're covered in glycoproteins and glycolipids. This makes these cells here strong, waterproof, resistant to abrasion, resistant to absorption, especially compounds that are polar or water-based. Lipid molecules can pass through. And it just makes it a tough outer layer that is constantly losing cells. Okay, remember that the basal layer, the very deepest layer, is dividing, and that pushes cells up through the layers. So by the time they get to this layer, there's no more layers, so they start to flake off in the form of dead skin cells. And the skin loses about 50,000 cells per minute. And I wrote down here, that in about one lifetime we lose 40 pounds of skin cells. So that's pretty gross, pretty crazy. All right, so that was the epidermis. Remember, the epidermis is this layer. It's actually 4 to 5 layers, but collectively it's a layer of epithelial tissue, specifically stratified squamous epithelial tissue that is avascular. Most of it is dead, is non-living. It's dead cells, remnants of dead cells. It's waterproofs the skin. It has defense mechanisms against bacteria. It is really like our armor on the outside of our skin. Just deep to that, we have the dermis. Now, the dermis is not epithelial tissue, it is connective tissue, specifically connective tissue proper. It's made up of 2 types. We'll get into that in a bit. It is rich in nerve and vascular supply. So there are all kinds of sensory receptors. Anytime we feel something, it's some receptor in this layer that is activating that. Okay, there are some receptors right on the border, but pretty much the dermis is responsible for all of our skin sensation. It is also highly vascular. So any cut or abrasion in your skin that goes through the epidermis will result in bleeding from this layer, from the dermis. This layer is responsible for supplying the epidermis with nutrients from its vascular tissue. It's also going to contain hair follicles, but don't be confused. Hair follicles are made up of epithelial tissue. That epithelial tissue dives down into the dermis to make a follicle, but hair follicles are located in the dermis. The dermis also contains all of our glands, sweat glands, oil glands, and sensory receptors, which we touched on earlier. Okay, so the dermis only has 2 layers. Remember, the epidermis had 4 to 5, depending if it was thin or thick skin. The dermis only has 2, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. If you look at this picture, you can see the papillary layer is this layer with all the little papilla. Okay, if you look at a three-dimensional picture of the skin, a lot of times they'll peel the dermis away, and you see it looks like egg crate on top of the dermis, like an egg crate mattress. And we'll see why that is in a second. And then the rest of the dermis is the reticular layer. Okay, so here's a picture showing the epidermal papillae being pulled apart from the dermal papillae. And this layer of dermal papilla, or papillae, is composed of areolar connective tissue. Okay, this is very highly vascularized here. Okay, there are these little tufts of capillaries in each of these papilla that supply nutrients to the overlying stratum basale and stratum spinosum, stratum basale and stratum spinosum. So nutrients are diffusing here to keep these cells that are actively dividing and young alive. You're also going to find lots of sensory receptors in this area, but you'll also find a lot in the other layers of the dermis. One other important feature of this is that the papillary layer is made out of areolar connective tissue, which means that it's relatively low density. This is great for white blood cells, phagocytes, to move around in. So they can move around this layer and look for invaders. The bottom layer is more dense, the reticular layer is more dense, so it's more difficult for white blood cells to move around. These papillae can align along ridges to form friction ridges in thin skin. Did I mean to put thick skin? I'm gonna have to look that up and put a comment on here. But they align along ridges, and in the fingers they form friction ridges or fingerprints. And then there are sensory receptors along these ridges, so they make our fingers highly sensitive and have a little bit more grip when we handle things. There are also cleavage lines, which are lines where the skin is more able to fold. And so that's where our skin naturally tends to fold. And then we have friction lines around our joints, like our fingers, where the dermis is adhered to the fascia below it, so the skin doesn't slide around as much. All right, here is the reticular layer. It's 80% of the thickness of the dermis, okay? So the papillary layer is pretty thin, about 20% of the dermis. The reticular layer is very thick. It is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. Remember in tissues, when we talked about tissues, dense irregular connective tissue had collagen fibers running in different planes, in many directions, making it a strong tissue in multiple directions. So it could withstand tension in multiple directions. So it makes sense why the thickest layer of our dermis would be made of this type of tissue, okay? Now, it has fibers running in multiple planes, but primarily these fibers are running parallel to the skin. So when our skin is pushed or pulled or rubbed against things, its basement, its foundation, is made up of this tissue, which can withstand tension in multiple directions, okay? And I mentioned this a bit on the last slide, but this is where we'll find lines where there's less of these fibers, making them cleavage lines, making them places where the skin naturally likes to fold. This is also the layer that will be adhered to the underlying fascia around joints to form flexure lines, like the lines in our palms and around our knuckles. Oh, and lastly, this has in the bottom part of this reticular layer is the cutaneous plexus, which is a blood vessel network that supplies the majority of the dermis with nutrients, oxygen, removes waste, all of that. Okay, so here we are getting to the appendages of the skin. Sorry, I'm trying to go quickly so you don't have to listen to a 3-hour webinar. We're going to be talking about hair and hair follicles, fingernails, toenails, nails basically, sweat glands, 2 types, and sebaceous oil glands. So first up is hair and hair follicles. We're going to be looking at the structure of hair, the structure of a follicle, types and growth of hair, and hair thinning and baldness. Okay, so hair is produced by hair follicles. Okay, like the epidermis, it's composed primarily of dead keratinized cells. Unlike the epidermis, these cells contain hard keratin. Hard keratin is stronger, and it prevents cells from flaking off, like the soft keratin in the epidermis. This makes your hair not flake. Your epidermis might be flaking in your hair in the form of dandruff, but the hair itself is not flaking. There are 2 regions: the base, the bottom, the very bottom part of the hair in your skin is the root, and then the part exposed to the air and the part immediately just under the skin is called the shaft. The shaft is made up of dead keratinized cells. The root is made up of living cells, living keratinocytes. If we cut the hair like if we were going to cut a tree down and look at the concentric layers, we see at the very center is a medulla. Now, the medulla is the only part of the hair that's made up of soft keratin. Medullas are only present in thick hair, in terminal hair, and they're not found in the fine vellus hair that's kind of referred to as peach fuzz, or that fine hair that you don't really see. It doesn't have a lot of color. The cortex is the area in the picture that is pink that surrounds the medulla. That's the bulk of the hair. And then wrapped around the cortex is the cuticle, which is the strongest part of the hair, which compresses all the keratinocytes and gives hair its shape and structure. All right, so hair follicles are what produce hair and contain the root and part of the shaft of the hair. They are epithelium-based. What that means is that the follicle wall, or the part of the follicle that contains the hair and produces the hair, is made up of epithelial tissue that dives down from the epidermis into the dermis. Okay, so the follicle is in the dermis, but the follicle itself is made of epidermal tissue. Okay, the bottom of the follicle swells in what's called a hair bulb. Okay, and that's going to contain the root of the hair. And wrapped around the hair bulb will be the hair follicle receptor, which is a free nerve ending that corkscrews around the bulb and detects movement in the hair. So if a bug lands on your hair or the wind blows on your hair, you feel it, you notice it. If you look at the bottom here, you see a little papilla. Okay, the hair papillae are little tufts of dermal tissue that go up they pop up from the bottom of the follicle. Okay, these papillae are going to contain blood vessels. Remember, the dermis is vascular, so that's why this is dermal tissue, because it contains blood vessels. These blood vessels supply the overlying cells, the cells on top of the papillae, which are epithelial cells, with nutrients. These epithelial cells on top of the hair papillae are called the hair matrix. Okay, and look in your book at this picture, because all these regions are labeled in your book. The hair matrix is what produces new keratinocytes in your hair. Okay, and just like skin, so it's kind of similar to the stratum basale in the epidermis. So just like skin, these cells will divide. One will remain to continue to divide, and one will move up the hair. And that's how your hair grows. The hair matrix produces new cells, pushing the old cells up and out of the follicle, and this continues to happen, and your hair grows. Okay, so the next few things are part of the epithelial wall. We have the follicular wall, the wall of the hair follicle. These are composed of the peripheral connective tissue sheath. So this is a sheath of connective tissue as part of the dermis that wraps around the follicle and holds it in place. And then dividing the connective tissue from the epithelial root sheath is a glassy membrane, inside of which is an epithelial root sheath. There's a couple layers, and this is just the epithelial tissue inside the follicle wall. And I put hair matrix again for some reason, I'm not sure why. And then attached to all of this is a little tiny muscle called the erector pili. Now this muscle, when it contracts, is not only going to make the hair stand up, it's also what gives you goosebumps. But when it makes the hair stands up, it opens the pore of the hair. The hole that the hair goes through is called the pore. Opens it up and squeezes your sebaceous oil glands, so this oil can be squeezed out onto your hair, okay, keeping your hair from becoming too dry, too damaged. There are two types of hair, vellus hair and terminal hair. Terminal hair basically has a medulla and is thick. It's the hair we have on our head. And if you're a guy, all over your face, your legs, if you haven't gone through puberty yet, testosterone hasn't turned all your vellus hair, which is that fine peach fuzz type of hair, into terminal hair. So vellus hair has no medulla and is very fine, and terminal hair is coarse and thicker and has a medulla. So I skipped growth of hair. I'm going to talk about it more here in hair thinning and baldness. So basically, your hair grows by your hair matrix dividing, by the keratinocytes in your hair matrix dividing, just in a way that your skin replaces cells by the stratum basale dividing. So hair grows in cycles. If it's on your head, it might grow for 6 to 10 years and then shut down for about 3 months, okay? So it grows in cycles, and this is regulated by all different types of proteins, but hair grows in cycles. The hair in your eyebrows is going to have a much shorter growth cycle, maybe only, I don't know exactly, maybe say 6 months. So that's why the hair in your eyebrows doesn't get as long as the hair on your head, because after, say, a few months of growing, it falls out. Your hair grows 6 to 10 years and then falls out. So what's important to remember is that not all of these hair follicles are on the same cycle. If they were, after, say, 10 years of your hair growing, all your hair would fall out, right? Because they're all staggered, we lose hair all the time. We just don't really notice it because there's still, for the most part, a lot of hair on our head or wherever. So this natural loss of hair over time with age is called alopecia. That's when your hair, each hair follicle only has so many cycles in it. So after going through a few cycles, they just die, they They go into a permanent rest mode, basically, and your hair starts to thin and fall out. This is normal. It's more dramatic in men, but it's normal. Age-related hair loss. And this is different from true baldness, specifically male pattern baldness, in which there is a dormant gene that switches on in adulthood. And this gene, coupled with a testosterone metabolite, will cause your hair growth cycles to speed up. Okay? So if your hair cycles speed up, your hair initially just won't get as long, say. But then, if it speeds up so much, that hair might not ever leave the follicle. It might just start to grow and then shut off, start to grow, shut off, fall out, fall out. And then, because follicles only have so many cycles in them, you go bald in a specific pattern. Okay, moving on to the fingernails. So, fingernails, these are really just they're really a modification of the epidermis. I'm trying to find, I think it's specifically the stratum corneum. I don't have any notes, but fingernails are a modification of the dermis, and they rest on the dermis. So they're made of hard keratin instead of soft keratin, making them look and appear differently. And they look pink because the vascular dermis lies underneath. The free edge is the part that we cut with fingernail clippers that protrudes from the skin and allows us to pick things up, open soda cans, stuff like that. The nail plate is the part attached to our dermis that looks pink, and the nail bed is that dermis underlying the nail plate. Okay. Now, the nail matrix, or the lunule, which is the little moon, the little half moon we see at the proximal part of our nail, is similar to the hair matrix, or the stratum basale. It's going to divide. And as it divides, it pushes the nail over the nail bed, and it grows. It moves, it slides along the nail bed and grows. On the lateral sides of the nail, we have nail folds, lateral nail folds. And on the proximal part of the nail, we have the proximal nail fold and the cuticle. All right, so that's just the general anatomy of the fingernails. I'm not going to go crazy on the quiz and test asking you guys about that. All right, so glands, specifically sweat or sudoriferous glands. There's two types, eccrine and apocrine. Eccrine are by far the most common. I think there's about 2 or 3 million sweat glands, only about 2,000 of which are apocrine. Okay, so eccrine are very common. They secrete sweat onto the skin. All right, through pores, through sweat pores. These are going to be really common on your forehead, the palms of your hands, your feet, and their primary job is to cool the body. Okay, they also secrete sweat, which is bactericidal and helps protect the body from bacteria. Sweat is mostly water, salt, but there are some wastes like urea, ammonia, uric acid that we are able to get rid of through our sweat. And these glands can also be activated by stress. And if we do have a stress-activated sweat response, it's going to start in our palms and our feet and spread proximally. If it's a heat-induced sweat, it's going to start in our forehead and spread distally. Sweat is just a blood filtrate. So the blood goes, blood vessels wrap around this gland, and essentially water and salt squeezes through the capillary walls into these glands, and it's secreted. Okay, so it's a blood filtrate. Apocrine glands, only about 2,000 of them, and they primarily empty into hair follicles, like oil glands. These glands release a substance that contains fat and other organic molecules, which bacteria decompose, and this decomposition process makes this smell. Okay, these are found primarily in our armpits and our axilla, which is why this is where body odor comes from. Not really sure why we have these. Your book says maybe They're the equivalent of the like animal scent glands, but we don't really know. Okay, sebaceous oil glands. These are simple branched alveolar glands. They're going to release into hair follicles primarily, occasionally pores, and they are holocrine. They're holocrine glands, meaning the cells fill with their substance, sebum, which is what they release. It's oil-based sebum, until they pop, okay? And then new cells below divide to replace them, and they just continue to pop, and that's how the oil is secreted. These are going to, again, be found heavily... Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know where I'm going with that. These are not found on the palms of the hands or soles of your feet. That's why your hands don't ever feel as oily as your face and things like that. Sorry, someone called me. Okay. So these secrete sebum onto the skin. They help waterproof the skin. They're also going to be bacteria resistant. The sebum is bacteria resistant, and they're highly activated by hormones. Hormones tend to activate them. That's why puberty, we get oily skin in puberty. Okay, so now we're getting into skin functions, and these are, in my opinion, the main three. Well, it's really one function, but and that's the function of protection. Okay, and there are three protective barriers the skin provides us. The first being a chemical barrier. So sweat and sebum are bactericidal. Okay, skin cells secrete defensins, which is a type of antibiotic that fights bacteria. And then our skin has what's called an acid mantle, which is just means that it has a low pH. Okay, it's acidic. Low pH means acidic. This keeps bacteria from dividing rapidly on our skin. There's still a lot of bacteria there, but this just checks their reproduction. Also, melanin is a chemical barrier against UV radiation. Okay, so it doesn't protect against bacteria, but protects against UV radiation. Physical barriers, that's obvious, right? It's a physical barrier between the external environment and the internal environment. Okay, it prevents water loss. It just, without our skin, we wouldn't be able to regulate our heat, our water, amount of water we have. We wouldn't be able to keep infections out. It'd be bad news. Okay. Also provides biological barriers. Dendritic cells activate the immune system, macrophages in the dermis, and DNA actually is another protection against UV rays. It basically heats up the water around it. It converts UV rays into harmless heat, and it makes our skin hot, but it prevents from damage from UV rays. Okay, and we mentioned this a bit earlier. The skin serves to regulate our body temperature. It can help us lose heat. It can promote heat loss through vasodilation, bringing more blood to the surface of the skin where heat can be transmitted to water and then evaporated in sweat. Okay, so we can lose heat through sweat. It can also help us conserve heat by constricting blood to the skin and shunting all that blood to the deeper layers, to our muscles, to our organs primarily, our crucial organs, and preventing lots of heat loss through the skin where it isn't very well insulated. Skin is also a sensory organ. If we couldn't feel things and recognize things by touch, and we wouldn't be able to use our iPhones or write or do any of the things we do. So our skin is packed with sensory receptors. There's several kinds. We're going to get into that when we get to special senses. Just remember that these receptors are primarily located in the dermis. All right, metabolic functions. You've probably heard that when you're in the sun, your skin produces vitamin D. So yeah, it's true. It produces a vitamin D precursor, which is later metabolized and turned into vitamin D. Vitamin D is incredibly important in calcium metabolism. We can't even absorb calcium without it. So our digestive system can't absorb calcium without it. It also serves to disarm some cancer-causing chemicals, which is very important, obviously. It can even accidentally turn some harmless chemicals into cancer chemicals. And then also it activates some steroid hormones. For example, cortisone will turn cortisone into hydrocortisone. So if you rub cortisone cream, your skin will convert it into an active form of hydrocortisone. It serves as a blood reservoir. At any given time, the skin holds about 5% of total blood volume. That will change depending on temperature and activity. If you're sprinting in the cold, your skin probably won't contain as much blood as if you're resting on the beach in the sun. Okay, but just on average, it contains about 5% of total blood volume. And we mentioned earlier that through sweat, the skin can serve to excrete waste like ammonia, uric acid, urea, salt. And water is not really a waste, but it's just another way to get rid of water if you need to. All right, homeostatic imbalances of skin. So anything, diseases of your skin, basically. There's several, but I just chose to talk about cancer. 3 types primarily. I just want you to know the differences between them. Basal cell carcinoma, most common, but least fatal. That's because it does not metastasize as readily as the other 2 types. If this is found relatively early, chances of survival are very good. Squamous cell carcinoma, much more fatal than basal cell carcinoma, less common, fortunately. This will present as a little red, like pustule type nodule thing. If you catch this early, it's good, but you have to be quick about this one. You have to make sure you don't have any of these. It is very metastatic. And then melanoma, the most fatal, the most highly metastatic, but fortunately the least common. This is a malignancy of the melanocyte. Remember, and this isn't necessarily the theory of why these are dangerous, but I'm just talking out loud. Melanocytes are designed to spread chemicals throughout the skin. So it makes sense to me, at least, that they're more highly metastatic than some of the other cells. But anyways, some ways to see if maybe it's just a freckle or if it's really a melanoma, which melanomas kind of look like freckles, is to see if they're asymmetrical or not. If they're asymmetrical, it could be a melanoma. If the border is irregular and jagged, it's likely a melanoma. If there has multiple colorations, it's likely a melanoma. If it has a large or changing diameter, especially if it's growing, it's a melanoma. And if it's elevated, they say about 1 millimeter of elevation, it's likely a melanoma. And that spells out A, B, C, D, E. And that's just a quick way to kind of assess whether or not it's a melanoma or just some skin marking or freckle. The only 100% surefire way to know is through a biopsy. And if caught early and removed, you can be fine, but just this is the most dangerous and most metastatic type of skin cancer. All right, I'm going to put the study. I actually put the study guide up already, so check it out. No notes on the quiz next week. So study hard. It's still a group quiz. I want you guys to talk about things and teach each other things. So I really want to view the quizzes as just a learning activity for the test. So next week we're going to be talking about skeletal tissues, bones, and I want to have a chance to review the test study guide in class. So make sure you're there by 6. Get there, we'll take the quiz, the group quiz, we'll go through bones, and then we'll do a study guide together in class. I'm not going to give you everything, but I just want to make sure you guys are on the right track. Sorry, I cruised through this. I want to get to bones, and I want to spend a lot of time, if able, reviewing next week. Okay, so listen to this and be sure to look at the quiz study guide. All right, I really try to narrow it down, and I want you to know a lot about some things versus very little about a lot of things. All right, so I want you to retain as much as possible. All right, see you guys on Monday. Enjoy lab, and good luck on the quiz.